Hello friends, it's Jen. Real quick, we're going to do a little video about binding. I'm going to bind this placemat right here with some scrappy binding, and I'm going to talk you through it. First of all, I like to leave an opening when I do my binding of about 10 to 12 inches so that I can make my binding join up just perfectly. Now in order to do that, I need to leave a little tail at the beginning of about 8 inches or so. So for the sake of that, I'm going to go ahead and start down here near the corner so that I have a tail and a good opening space. I do like to do a little bit of a back stitch when I start binding, and that's because for me to do that join, I do tend to pull on the quilt a little bit, or in this case, the quilted placemat. So I need to strengthen that. Sorry, I hit the tripod with my elbow. And then when I sew my binding on, I sew it on usually at about 1/4 of an inch. Sometimes a little bit bigger in this case because I plan to hand finish it. And I like the front to be not so small and the back not so big. That being said, if I have something that's pieced to the edges and I don't want to lose my points, I definitely sew that on at a true 1/4 of an inch. I'm using a 2.5 inch binding. All right, let me talk you through the corners since I just kind of did the last one without telling you what I'm doing. What I'm going to do is keep sewing until I am about 1/4 of an inch from the edge. I leave my needle down, pivot 45 degrees, and sew off the corner. Then I lift my needle up, lift my foot up, pull this out, and I move my binding all the way up so that the raw edge of the binding is forming a straight line with the raw edge of my quilted project. It can't be over here. It can't be over here. We need a straight line, okay? Then that gives me this nice mitered corner. Then I hold that down with my fingers and fold this down carefully. Now I need to make sure that my fold up here is not in from the raw edge and not protruding beyond that raw edge on the top. It needs to be flush, both on the top here and on the side. And then I just go ahead and drop my foot and start sewing again right from the edge. And sew all the way down this side. The other thing when I'm sewing binding on, especially like right now where I don't have my walking foot on, I do like to use my fingers to kind of keep pushing this binding fabric up so that I don't get it all bunched up down here. I do not pin my binding in place prior to sewing it on. I just float and let it go. I used to pin it in place and then things would bunch up a little bit and it just got to be obnoxious, so I don't. Alright, so I sew about 1/4 of an inch to the edge, pick it up, sew off the corner, lift my needle, lift my foot, lift the binding up so that I have a straight line right here. Now guys, if you need to take it off of the sewing machine to get this right and to have it right up here where you can see it, please do that. But mitering it properly here will get it mitered properly when it's finished. I'm going to put my fingers down to hold that fold in place. Make sure this folded edge is flush with the top and this raw edge is flush with the raw edge on the side, and start sewing again. Now, you might struggle to visualize what 1/4 of an inch from the edge looks like, so you don't know when to stop your needle. And you don't want to go too far, and you definitely don't want to stop too soon. So, here's my trick. I'll take a pin and I'll stick it in at about 1/4 of an inch from the edge. That way I know that when my needle, my sewing machine needle here, gets that pin, that's when I stop. Lift it up, pivot 45 degrees, and sew off the corner. Okay? Then we pivot back, lift our foot, pull it out. Remember, all the way up. Nice straight line. Hold the fold down with your fingers. All the way back down. Make sure your fold is flush with the top and the raw edges are flush with the raw edge of your quilted project. And start sewing again. Now this is my final side. So I'm only going to sew a few inches here. And then I'm going to stop. And that is because I want to do a join so that everything just magically fits and my binding is exactly the right length. Now, in order to do this, I need to have some kind of measuring device for how wide my binding is. You can grab a ruler. I just snip off a piece of binding because I'm fancy, but mostly because you will always have this to hand. And if you forgot that you made your binding at 2¼ inches instead or something, you don't have to remember it because this is the size. So I'm going to lay this down. This long tail should be about 2/3 of the open space. Mine's a little longer than that because I came down a little bit further than I probably should have. And so I'm going to trim it a little shorter. Now, I have a lot of people, when I show them how to do this, they want to leave this open space as, really small. Because sometimes we get in the habit of wanting to close as much as possible. It's like when you're making a bag and you know you're going to have to stitch that shut by hand. So you try and leave the opening too small and then you end up ripping it because the opening was too small. Same thing happens here. It will make your life easier if this space is at least 10 inches. 12 is better, especially on a large quilt. Okay, because we're still going to machine stitch it shut. You're not going to have to do it by hand, so don't worry about it. So I'm going to lay this first piece down. Then I take my little handy measuring device here. I usually do turn it so that it's right sides facing. And the reason for that is because then I can see the back of the fabric and I can definitely differentiate. I also have it protruding up from beyond the binding here. And then I'm going to take my other binding piece and lay that over the top. And the reason for this is I want the blue stripe binding piece and this aqua stripe binding piece to overlap by the same amount that they are wide, which in this case is 2½ inches. So once I have that on there, I just grab my scissors and cut. Now, if anything, I want you to measure a little small. And by a little small, guys, look, I mean like less than 1/8 of an inch. Okay, I'm not talking 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch. That's too small and you're going to end up puckering your project. But we don't want it to be too big. So if anything, go a little small, but no more than like 1/8 of an inch, a little small. See, and now I have new leader ender. For those of you who know, I'm obsessed with those. Now, how do we make the join? It's really the same as when we make binding. Okay, so we're going to make a letter A. Here's the left stand of our letter A, and here's the right of the blue. I'm going to take this blue, see how I've made an A here, or the base of a letter A here. I am going to turn this right side down onto that. Okay, now this is really awkward, so we just go ahead and squish our little quilted project. No problem, it'll reopen. It's okay to squish fabric. It can be pressed, it'll be fine. And because I'm pulling on stuff here, I am going to pin this. I don't usually pin when I sew binding together, but I do when I sew this because it's really hard to get that to keep laying straight when I turn it to sew like this, okay? Now, the reason I say we make a letter A, because see, here's our left slanted line, and here's our right slanted line. What you need to remember to do is to cross the A. That's the line we're going to sew. We're going to cross the letter A. Okay? So it can be really hard to see where you're sewing. We know where we're starting. Clearly that's up here. But where are we going to? So I will just lift that up and find my target. And then I have my diagonal seam tape on my machine, so I don't necessarily need to draw the line. But if you don't have something like diagonal seam tape, first of all, you should probably get some because it's like a game changer for quilter world. I love it. Or, just draw the line. And I'll just go ahead and draw a line around here and I'll sew on that line, just like when we make binding. Okay? Oh, you know what, guys? My bobbin ran out. Oh, it's because I'm doing a video. Oh, well, such is life. It's been a bit of a morning. But you know what? This is why I always have bobbins wound. When I wind bobbins, I wind like 6 at a time because I hate having to stop to wind a bobbin. So if I have to do it, I might as well do a whole bunch. Oh, it would help if I held on to my tail. Sorry, you guys know our videos are all real life stuff. I suppose I could pause and edit this out, but you know. This is us. This is me. This is how I am. All right, now let's redo that seam. All right, back to where we were. Now, before you cut this excess off, I want you to test it. Make sure you did it right, okay? You'll know you did it right if you open it up and it lays down nice and flat, okay? If you got it twisted or you made it way too short or something, better to know now than when you clip these off. So then I just cut that excess off, and I will finger press this seam open. I always press my binding open because, I mean, the point of the diagonal seam is to not have bulk for binding. And so if we press the side, then we're kind of losing part of the point. Anyway, and then I just start up here where I left off and sew down that side. Notice I'm still using my finger here just to push that binding up and out of the way so that I don't have puckers. All right, I want to talk for just a moment now about ways to finish binding. First things first, to get your corners nice and flat, you need to make sure that you're folding them in the right order, okay? And that means this bulky side over here that has 3 layers of binding, you need to fold that over first, and then this side second. Because what that does is, this is the bulky side on the front, but now this is the bulky side on the back. And so they kind of cancel each other out and will let the corner lay nice and flat instead of being kind of, if I do it the other way, let me do it the other way and show you. This spot gets really thick and it can be really hard to get a nice corner on the back because this side just gets so thick and this side is not. So I always fold the bulky side down first. The next thing is, if you're going to machine finish, there are 2 ways to do it. One would be stitch in the ditch, and that is where you fold this over. And I'm going to make my seam nice and long because I'm just going to pull this out because I'm a hand finisher. And you sew very slowly. The trick to stitch in the ditch is to sew slowly. Also, think about it like driving a car. Don't stare at your needle. You need to prepare to have things in the right place before they get to your needle. If this isn't lined up with your needle here, trying to do micro corrections up here won't be any good. So go nice and slow. That's actually too fast. And you stitch right in that ditch between your quilt top and the binding. You can totally see my stitches because I have a navy binding there and a gray fabric. But that's stitch in the ditch. It would be to stitch right here, and then it kind of can be a little wobbly on the back, but it works fine. Now my sister, she always, when she does machine binding, she attaches the binding to the back of the project and finishes it on the front, which is a totally relevant school of thought. We are going to pretend for a second that this is the front of the quilt and that I attach the binding to the back. Now when she does that, she's still folding it over, but she's not looking at the ditch. She's looking at this on the front because you're going to have some space between where you stitch and the edge of your fabric. We call that a little flange, okay? She likes to control that flange. She likes to make sure that's nice and narrow and even because that's what bugs her. So she finishes it like this on the front, which is another totally legitimate method, very common. And when you do that, it does look really nice that way. And on the back side, pretend this is the back of the quilt, it comes a little bit off your binding Of course, I did it on an area that's white. So it doesn't really land in the ditch. But, you know, she figures that's the back of the quilt, so that's fine. So it's really up to you, one way or the other. It's really about personal preference. I personally prefer to flip mine over and do a little whip stitch or a little whip stitch or ladder stitch all the way around and have my binding seam being totally invisible. Now for doing corners, whether you're going to do it by machine or by hand, the trick to getting your corners to look nice is to prep them. So first of all, we want to fold it nicely. The other thing I see a lot is people will take this second fold and try and get it up here like that. Okay, we're not trying to get this fold with the edge here. The back should be mitered just like the front. Okay, so I just adjust that until it sits nicely. And then whether I'm sewing by hand or by machine, I make sure that corner is nice and prepped and put some clips on it and stitch it like that. And then when I'm doing it by hand, I sew up the corner. I sew up the corner here. But this is the way our back corners should look. And we get that by folding the bulky side down first and then the non-bulky side. And remember, when I say bulky side, I mean from the front. Okay? This is the side with 3 pieces of binding on it. So that's from the front. We fold that down first. And then we fold the other side down. And now the bulky side on the back is opposite the bulky side on the front, which gives us a nice flat corner. I hope this helps you with your binding. I know a lot of people are totally afraid of binding, and I want them to be comfortable with it because I actually really like, well, I'm a handwork person anyway, but I love sitting down and finishing a quilt and doing that hand binding. It's, especially on a rainy day like today, I get to go sit inside on my chaise with a quilt on my lap and call it work. And that makes for a good day any day. So enjoy. If you have questions, let us know. Thanks. Bye.